Hello everybody and welcome to the Thursday edition of Video Clips. And I decided today to cover a study that many of you have written to me about or commented about. And it's a study published in the British Medical Journal that concluded that fish eaters and vegetarians had a lower rate of ischemic heart disease than meat eaters, but that vegetarians had higher rates of hemorrhagic and total stroke. So in response to this article, the paleo and keto promoters were giving each other the high five. They were ecstatic about it, and the plant eaters were completely deflated and saying, oh my gosh, how can this be? Well, all of these groups, I think, grossly misreported and misunderstood the significance of the study's findings, how the study was conducted, where the data came from, and a lot of other things. So I'm going to attempt to straighten that out for you today. So the results were drawn from the EPIC Oxford study, which includes about 65,000 men and women who were recruited from the United Kingdom between 1993 and 2001. A baseline questionnaire asked 4 questions concerning the consumption of meat, fish, dairy, and eggs. And then these questions were used to assign people to 4 categories, which were meat eaters, participants who ate meat regardless of whether or not they were eating fish, dairy, and eggs; the fish eaters who did not eat meat but did eat fish; vegetarians, participants who didn't eat meat or fish but consumed dairy and eggs; and vegans who did not eat meat, fish, dairy, or eggs. Now, the first thing that you need to understand is that there were so few vegans that the vegan group was combined with the vegetarian group. Another thing that's important in learning of what's really going on here is that the baseline questionnaire included a food frequency section with 130 food items, which asked subjects to evaluate their dietary intake during the previous year. Some specific dietary records were obtained to validate these food frequency questionnaires, but in order to calculate food intake, the frequency of consumption for each food and beverage was multiplied by a standard portion size. To calculate nutrient intake, food composition tables were used. Data were gathered on factors like education, smoking, physical activity, dietary supplement use, oral contraceptives, hormonal replacement therapy, socioeconomic status, many other things, and then follow-up questionnaires were completed by most of the participants. So the first thing that we have an issue with, that I have an issue with, is self-reported data. Which is notoriously inaccurate. For example, according to one research group, the self-reported dietary data provided by Americans as part of the USDA's National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, that's the NHANES report, is essentially meaningless because there's a great deal of disparity between what people say they eat and what they actually do eat. The authors write that memory-based dietary information is fundamentally and fatally flawed and should not be used in public policy discussions or for developing dietary guidelines for Americans. The authors report that in a high percentage of surveys, respondents report that they consume fewer calories than what would be required just to meet calorie needs to sustain basal metabolic rate. In other words, what people are reporting is they don't even eat enough to sustain their current weight, so they should all be losing weight. But the opposite is true, and you can confirm this by going to any shopping mall this afternoon and taking a look at people. Most people are overweight or obese, so that means that the information that people are providing has to be inaccurate. Lead researcher Ed Archer said that surveys involving self-reported data are not better than nothing, but rather they are worse than nothing, quote, because they give us the illusion of knowledge. Furthermore, it's impossible to quantify the level of underreporting in order to make the data useful. Instead, he says, there is underreporting and overreporting in every category and no discernible pattern. He says the best we can expect to get from surveys like this is, quote, an interesting insight into people's perceptions about what they eat, not what they are actually eating. In the case of the EPIC study, not only were the data self-reported, but part of the self-reporting included going back through history and determining what people had eaten during the last year. So I want you to ask yourself these questions. During the previous year, how many times did you eat an apple, like for the last 12 months? How often do you eat asparagus? How many potatoes or servings of potatoes do you eat in a given week or month? Most of you probably can't provide accurate information about that, and I can't. And I'm in this business. I'm hyper aware of what I eat, but I can't tell you how many green beans I had last week. I can tell you I didn't have any yesterday. That might be the best that I can do. All right, so that's problem number 1, self-reported data. Problem number 2, definitions. The vegetarian category. Vegetarians were eating dairy, eggs, or both. Eggs are high in cholesterol and fat, with just one egg containing 250 milligrams of cholesterol and 20% of calories from saturated fat. A study published in the Canadian Journal of Cardiology showed that those who consume the most eggs have a 19% risk of cardiovascular disease, and just 1 egg per day can increase the risk of cardiovascular disease for diabetics. The researchers wrote, quote, patients at risk of cardiovascular disease should limit their intake of cholesterol. Stopping the consumption of eggs after a stroke or myocardial infarction would be like quitting smoking after a diagnosis of lung cancer. A necessary action, but late. Dairy, on the other hand, is the leading source of saturated fat in westernized diets. Just 1 ounce of cheddar cheese contains 6 grams of saturated fat. That's just a tiny amount, by the way, just like the size of my finger here. And just a half a cup of vanilla ice cream contains 4.5 grams of saturated fat. In addition to this, one can eat a diet that qualifies as plant-based. It can be called vegetarian or vegan, but quite unhealthy because of junk foods. So for example, potato chips and beer and cookies and pastries can all be vegan, but they're not health promoting. And many of the meat and cheese substitutes that are really common these days are just as high in calorie and fats as the foods they replace in the diet. The bottom line is that all of the groups were consuming foods high in saturated fat and cholesterol. Since the vegans were such a small population that they were folded in with the vegetarians, it's not likely that the elimination of animal foods by this particular group would be able to influence the outcome from the vegetarian cohort. The vegetarians were just about the same as the meat and fish eaters. Okay, so now let's go to what the results really showed. Analysis of this highly flawed data showed that vegetarian diets were associated with 10 fewer cases of ischemic heart disease per 1,000 population over a 10-year period. Okay, that's great. 3 more cases of total stroke per 1,000 population over 10 years. Now, to me, it's surprising that there were any differences at all, since the diets were actually very similar in terms of fat and cholesterol, macronutrient makeup of the diet. Even so, the researchers actually wrote in the article they attributed the lower incidence of ischemic heart disease the fish eaters and vegetarians experienced to their lower body mass index, lower incidence of hypertension, lower cholesterol, and lower incidence of diabetes. Now, the authors themselves acknowledged some limitations. They said that while the cohort was large, that was an advantage. A limitation of the study is the fact that the data were self-reported. They said this, they wrote this themselves. They stated that they did not collect data on drug treatment, including statin drugs. Now, if enough at-risk meat eaters who met the criteria for people who would benefit from taking a statin drug were included in this study, this may have given drugged meat eaters a slight advantage. And that's my comment, not theirs, by the way, but they acknowledge that not including data on drugs might have had an influence. Finally, the authors admit that confounding factors from both dietary and non-dietary issues is possible, which could skew the results. One other thing I'll mention, we have had other questionable/useless data from EPIC researchers before. For example, a study published in 2010 reported that eating more servings of fruits and vegetables did not significantly reduce the risk of cancer, writing that, quote, a high intake of vegetables and fruits combined is associated with a small reduction in overall cancer risk. Again, I remember when this was published and a lot of people promoting plant-based diets were deflated. Oh my gosh, it shows it doesn't make any difference. Well, analysis of this study showed that the higher intake of fruits and vegetables was about 150 grams per day, the equivalent of about 1 cup of cherry tomatoes or 1.5 medium bananas. Now, the first thing is none of us who are promoting a plant-based diet for the prevention of cancer or anything else are talking about eating an extra cup of cherry tomatoes or an extra banana a day. But hardly constitutes high intake. But even so, if you were to apply this to the general population, if everybody would eat the extra cherry tomatoes and or a banana and a half a day, you'd reduce the risk of cancer by 2.5% in the general population. If you take a look at the cancer data, that would be significant. Think what would happen if everybody adopted a really good, well-structured, high-fiber, low-fat, whole foods, plant-based diet like the one we talk about here. So the bottom line is that if you are a plant eater, you shouldn't be sideways about this. This is a lot of fuss about nothing. It's a typical thing that happens, is that a study that really doesn't say much about anything at all gets blown out of proportion by people who have a reason to blow it out of proportion. If you're a paleo or keto person and you want to minimize the effect of plant eating, this is one good way to do it. This study is observational. It's plagued by poor study design, and it's reported data that really is pretty meaningless in terms of deciding what you're going to do for your own health and what diet you're going to eat. So I hope that helps sort out the confusion. A lot of you have been asking about choline as well. As I mentioned during the dietary guidelines videos that I filmed after we all testified at the Dietary Guidelines Committee, the agriculture groups, egg, meat, dairy, all promoting this idea that choline deficiency can only be avoided if you eat a diet high in animal foods. Absolutely not true. I wrote an article about it. It appeared in the newsletter a couple weeks ago. It's posted in our library now. It's well referenced, and the choline issue, it took a long time to do this just to get to the bottom of it, because there are so many misunderstandings about the amount of choline that people should be eating, and nobody really knows, by the way, the answer to that question. There's been a lot of guesstimating. That's part of the problem. So you can go to our library if you're a member and read that article and sort out some more confusion for yourself. All right, I hope that this is helpful, and as usual, if you're not a subscriber, hit the subscriber button. If you'd like to get the newsletter and you don't get the newsletter, email me, pampopper@msn.com. I can add you to that list. And don't forget, Breast Cancer Awareness Week is coming soon, and if you want to help us and become involved in this fabulous effort to actually do something constructive to help women reduce their risk, pampopper@msn.com will get you enrolled to either get your free gift for signing the pledge card, or we'll make arrangements for you to have pledge cards to promote to other people. pampopper@msn.com. All right, I'll be back to you next week with more news.